This is an introduction to Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. Our author, John Steinbeck, was born in February 27th, 1902 in Salinas, California. Here's a picture of Salinas, California. During his childhood, Steinbeck learned to appreciate his surroundings, and he loved the Salinas countryside and the nearby Pacific Ocean. It would be his appreciation that would come out later in his writing. Steinbeck would work summers as a hired hand in nearby ranches, as you can see in this picture, a ranch in Salinas, California. This is where he learned a lot about how ranches work. Some famous works by Steinbeck. In 1935, he won his first literary prize, the Commonwealth Club of California Gold Medal for Best Novel by a Californian, for his novel Tortilla Flat. Then in 1937, Of Mice and Men was published, and it was so widely accepted that Steinbeck began a book tour that led him to Europe. In 1939, The Grapes of Wrath was published and became an instant bestseller. No, it is not a book about angry grapes. It is actually a book about migrant workers during the Great Depression, which we'll get to in a little bit. But it was so important in reflecting the lives of migrant workers that in 1940 it won the Pulitzer Prize, which is one of the most prestigious literary awards in the world. He then went on in 1962 to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. Both Of Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath stemmed from his experience working among migrant workers. He went into the fields to research what life was like for these migrant workers, and it led him to have more compassion for them and stirred up his concern for social justice. The Great Depression came along in 1929 when the stock market crashed in October. The banks were forced to close, businesses were closed or had to reduce their employment, so unemployment was at record highs. This picture here is part of the daily lineup outside of the State Employment Service office in Memphis, Tennessee in 1938. In addition to the Great Depression, the Great Plains were suffering through the Dust Bowl. There was horrible drought going on in the plains, and then terrible dust storms. Years and years of overgrazing combined with the effects of the drought caused the grass to disappear. With just topsoil exposed, high winds picked up the loose dirt and whirled it for miles. The dust storm destroyed everything in their path, leaving farmers without their crops. Well, during the Great Depression, millions of people were out of work across the United States. Since they couldn't find jobs locally, many of them hit the road, traveling from place to place hoping to find some work. A few of these people had cars, but most hitchhiked or rode the rails. The farmers who lost their homes and land usually headed west to California, where they'd heard that there were agricultural jobs. Unfortunately, while there was some seasonal work, the conditions for these families were not good. Since many of these farmers came from Oklahoma and Arkansas, they were called derogatory names such as Okies or Arkies. These travelers or migrant workers would set up housing along the way using whatever materials they could find, like driftwood or cardboard or even newspapers. Some were lucky enough to even have tents. But California was not the promised land that the migrants were hoping for. The weather was nice and the fields were full of produce, but the Californians were going through the Depression also, and this stream of newly arriving migrant workers was more than what they could handle. After struggling to make it in California, many of the migrant workers found themselves turned away at its borders. Those who did get into California found that there were more workers than jobs, and so the wages were really, really low. Even with an entire family working, migrants could not support themselves on these low wages. Many set up camps along irrigation ditches in the farmers' fields. These ditch bank camps fostered poor sanitary conditions and created a public health problem, as you can imagine them bathing in the water there. Well, the migrant workers would earn about $2.50 or $3 a day, plus food and shelter. And while that sounds incredibly low for today's standards, it was still low then, even though it was worth more than it is now. With so many men searching for work, agencies were set up to send farmers to where they needed. This is a picture of a place where people could go to get work. You can see the men desperately trying to get work from the agency. So let me set the scene. George and Lenny in Of Mice and Men are migrant workers during the Great Depression in Salinas, California. They've just received work cards from Murray and Reddy's, which is a work farm agency similar to what you see in this picture here. Now, in the novel, the characters refer to themselves as bindle stiffs. So, what is a bindle stiff? Well, a bindle is another word for a bundle. And bindle stiffs were men who were migrant workers. They traveled from ranch to ranch and job to job, carrying the few belongings that they had in this bundle on their shoulders. Therefore, they did not own a whole lot because they could only own what they could carry with them from ranch to ranch. Most of these bindle stiffs also traveled alone, which would make for a very lonely life. In Of Mice and Men, our main characters, George and Lenny, are different in that they travel together. You'll learn why in the first chapter. Well, that's what you need to know to get started on this novel. We'll start reading it together next class.